An 8-year-old girl stood trembling in a packed town hall, clutching an old Bible, and asked Donald Trump a question that left the entire room in stunned silence. "What does God mean to you?" His unexpected response wasn't just an answer. It was a revelation that moved everyone to tears. What happened next? You won't believe it. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow, we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The air inside the small church fellowship hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, buzzed with quiet conversation, the hum of anticipation thickening as people settled into their folding chairs. The scent of old wood and faint traces of coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the sound of hushed voices and the occasional scraping of chairs against the polished floor. The space, usually reserved for Sunday gatherings and community potlucks, had transformed into an unlikely stage for the evening's event, one that had drawn an audience eager to hear from the man standing at the front of the room. Donald Trump, a towering figure in American politics, stood behind the podium, his unmistakable presence commanding attention. His voice, known for its bombastic energy at rallies, was notably more measured here. The usual bravado remained, but there was something different about him tonight. A quiet awareness of the setting, of the weight of the moment. Among the crowd, nestled between her mother and an elderly couple, sat 8-year-old Lily. Dressed in her best Sunday dress, her hair neatly combed, she was far smaller than the adults surrounding her, her legs barely reaching the floor as she clutched an old leather-bound Bible to her chest. It was more than just a book to her. It was a piece of her grandmother, a woman who had once held Lily on her lap and read to her from its worn pages, whispering stories of faith and resilience. Since her grandmother's passing, that Bible had become Lily's most treasured possession, a connection to the wisdom and comfort she had lost. Tonight she held it tightly, as if drawing strength from it, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on its cover. For weeks, a question had been forming in Lily's mind, a question she had rehearsed in whispers before bedtime, scribbled onto scraps of paper during school recess, and finally committed to memory. It wasn't a childish curiosity, nor was it something she had thought of on a whim. It was a question that had been weighing on her young heart, growing heavier with each passing day. Her mother had noticed the way Lily's eyes would linger on that Bible when she thought no one was looking, the way she seemed lost in thought more often than not. And so, before they left home that evening, her mother had knelt beside her and whispered, "You can ask him, sweetheart, but only if you're truly ready." Lily had nodded, but now, sitting in that crowded room, her heart pounded with a nervous energy she couldn't shake. Trump spoke, his voice carrying over the audience, touching on familiar topics: policy, leadership, the state of America's future. His words were met with nods of agreement, scattered applause, and the occasional murmur of approval. Yet, while the adults around her seemed captivated, Lily barely heard any of it. She was too busy steadying her breath, gripping her Bible a little tighter each time she gathered and lost the courage to rise from her chair. Her mother glanced down at her, giving her a subtle, reassuring nod, but the weight of the moment pressed down on Lily's small shoulders. Could she really do this? Would he even listen? Then, as the speech wound down, the moderator stepped forward and announced that the floor was open for questions. A line quickly formed at the microphone stand. Adults eager to address pressing issues, their voices blending into a cacophony of political concerns. Lily watched them, her small hands trembling slightly as she hesitated. This was her chance. If she didn't stand now, she might never find the courage again. Her mother's hand brushed against hers, a silent encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Lily rose from her seat, clutching her Bible like a lifeline as she took her first step forward. The moment she did, something changed. The quiet shuffling of the audience slowed. Conversations faltered. People turned their heads. A small girl with an oversized Bible, her frame barely noticeable among the towering adults, her presence alone seemed to command a different kind of attention, and as she stepped into line waiting for her turn to speak, an unspoken curiosity spread through the room. What could she possibly have to ask? No one knew yet, but they were about to find out. The line of questioners inched forward, one by one stepping up to the microphone to pose their inquiries. The room, once a quiet hum of casual conversation, was now charged with an expectant energy. Some asked about policy, others about the economy. A few even threw in lighthearted comments about Trump's unmistakable red tie, drawing brief laughter. But as each adult took their turn, asked their question, and received their answer, one small figure stood out: Lily. She was still there, still waiting, still gripping her Bible tightly against her chest as if it were her shield against the weight of the moment. Her breath quickened as the people ahead of her dwindled. The nerves that had been buzzing beneath her skin for days now felt like they might swallow her whole. She had rehearsed this question over and over again, whispered it in the stillness of her room at night, imagined how she would say it. But now, standing in line, she wasn't sure if her voice would even come out when she finally got to the microphone. What if her words tangled? What if people laughed? And then, suddenly, it was her turn. Lily took a hesitant step forward, the microphone standing taller than she expected. A moment passed before she adjusted it slightly, her small hands trembling. The crowd, which had been engaged but somewhat restless, began to take notice of the tiny girl who had just stepped up to speak. From the podium, Trump's gaze fell on her. His expression, once full of calculated responses and political confidence, softened ever so slightly. He arched a brow, intrigued. This wasn't the typical face of a questioner at these events. This was a child. A little girl. "And what's your question, young lady?" His voice, usually commanding and brash, had an unfamiliar gentleness to it. Lily swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She gripped the edges of the microphone stand and, in the quietest but most resolute voice she could manage, she asked, "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The moment the words left her lips, the air in the room shifted. Silence. A silence so profound, it felt as if the very walls of the hall were listening. The usual murmurs, the shuffling of papers, the occasional cough that had punctuated the night's discussion, all of it vanished in an instant. Trump's expression changed. He had expected policy questions, economic concerns, maybe even a jab from a critic in the audience, but this was different. The weight of her question wasn't lost on him. His fingers, which had been loosely clasped together on the podium, slowly curled against the wood. He stared at Lily, then at the Bible she clutched so tightly to her chest. For the first time that night, he didn't have an immediate answer. There was no quick-witted remark, no practiced response. Just... The audience, sensing something rare, remained frozen. Even those who had been scrolling through their phones or whispering to their neighbors now found themselves sitting up straighter, drawn into the gravity of the moment. Lily, though young, could feel it too. She hadn't expected such a long pause. She watched Trump, her heart thumping against her ribs, wondering if she had somehow asked the wrong thing. Had she offended him? Had she spoken out of turn? But then Trump finally moved. He exhaled slowly and leaned against the podium, resting his weight on his hands. His expression was different now, less of the polished, confident politician and more of something else, something personal, something real. "That's a big question," he said at last, his voice lower than before, "and it's not one I've always had the answer to." The audience remained silent, hanging on his every word. Trump glanced down for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts, before lifting his gaze back to the little girl in front of him. "When I was about your age," he continued, "I had a lot of questions about God too. My parents would take me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those pews staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even listening to me." Lily's grip on her Bible loosened just a little. Trump let out a breath, one that carried a weight of its own. "My father used to tell me something," he said. "He told me that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time. And sometimes you're afraid you'll fall. But you keep climbing because there's something up there worth reaching for." A hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. It was subtle, but it was there. People weren't just listening now, they were feeling something. Trump let the words settle before he continued, his voice softer than before. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet, he admitted, allowing a faint smirk to pass over his lips. A few in the audience chuckled lightly, but it was brief, because they knew this was leading somewhere deeper. Lily didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She just watched him, with wide, unwavering eyes. Trump took another breath, his voice growing more thoughtful. But as I got older, life threw a lot of challenges my way. I faced losses, failures, moments where I wasn't sure if I could keep going. And in those times, I didn't always feel like God was with me. Sometimes I was angry at him. Other times, I thought maybe he'd given up on me altogether. A lump formed in Lily's throat. The room was utterly still. "But I'll tell you this," Trump said, straightening slightly, his voice regaining its firmness. "Even in my worst moments, when I thought I was alone, I realized that faith isn't about always having the answers. It's about believing that even when you don't see the whole picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work." He looked at Lily again, his gaze steady, his words slow and deliberate. "And God, to me, is that purpose." Lily blinked, her eyes glistening now. "He's the reminder," Trump continued, "that even when we fall, even when we fail, we're not done. He's the one who keeps telling us to climb the ladder, even when it feels like it's going to break." And then, without warning, a single tear slipped down Lily's cheek. A murmur ran through the crowd, soft and reverent. Some shifted in their seats, others wiped their eyes. Something real had just happened. Something beyond politics, beyond speeches and rehearsed rhetoric. Something that everyone in that room would remember for a long time to come. The moment lingered, stretching across the room like a thread of something sacred. No one dared to break the silence that had settled over them. Lily stood frozen in place, her Bible still clutched in her hands, the tear that had slipped down her cheek now absorbed into the soft fabric of her dress. Even Donald Trump, a man known for his quick comebacks and unshakable confidence, seemed caught in the weight of his own words. His eyes, which often scanned crowds with the sharp precision of a strategist, were now locked onto hers with an intensity that felt different. Something softer, something deeper. Then, just as the moment seemed on the verge of passing, Lily's small, unsteady voice filled the air. "My grandma used to say that too," she whispered, barely above a breath. Trump's gaze flickered, a brief but unmistakable sign that her words had struck him. "She did?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more personal. Lily nodded, the movement almost imperceptible. "She used to tell me that God never stops listening, even when we stop talking to him." A few quiet gasps rippled through the audience, some murmurs of agreement, others simply in awe of the profound wisdom spilling from an 8-year-old girl. Even the harshest critics of Trump, those who had come to challenge or scrutinize, found themselves momentarily disarmed. Trump straightened slightly, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. He took a slow breath, as if choosing his next words carefully. "You know," he said after a moment, "I think your grandma was onto something." He let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "A lot of people think faith is something you just have, like it's automatic, like it's always there when you need it." His gaze drifted across the room now, touching on the faces of men and women who had come expecting a political discussion and instead found themselves wrapped in something else entirely. But the truth is, faith is something you fight for. The air in the room seemed to tighten. Trump's tone shifted, not to one of defiance, but of conviction. "I've been in places in my life," he continued, "where I wasn't sure if God was even paying attention to me anymore. Times when I thought maybe he'd turned his back. Maybe he had more important things to worry about than me." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. "And you know what? I think a lot of people feel that way. I think there are millions of Americans out there right now wondering if God's still listening, if he's still watching over them, if they matter. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, not in disagreement, but in understanding. Heads nodded, expressions softened. Trump leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough to draw them in. "And you know what I've realized?" he asked, letting the question hang for a beat before answering it himself. "God never stops listening. We stop believing, He's listening." Lily's lips parted slightly, her small fingers pressing tighter against her Bible. Trump's eyes returned to her. "We let the world tell us that faith is outdated, that it's naive, that people who believe in God are somehow weak." He shook his head. "But I've met some of the strongest people in this country, some of the toughest, bravest men and women you could ever imagine. And do you know what they all have in common?" Lily's head tilted slightly. "They believe in something bigger than themselves." A quiet yes came from somewhere in the crowd. Then another. Someone whispered, "Amen." Trump glanced at the audience now, his voice deepening. "You want to know why this country is still standing? Why, no matter what happens, no matter how much people try to divide us, try to tear us down, we always find a way to get back up?" He tapped his finger against the podium. "Because of faith. Because people like you, like this little girl right here, still believe that there's something greater at work. That this isn't all just chaos and accidents. That there's a plan." Lily's small chest rose and fell with a deep breath, her young mind absorbing every word. "And I'll tell you something else," Trump continued, his voice steady but charged with something electric now. "People in power, the ones making the rules, the ones deciding what you can say, what you can believe, they don't want you to have faith. Because people who have faith, real faith, don't live in fear." A few murmurs of agreement echoed across the room. Trump let that statement sit for a moment before he went on. "I've seen it. I've seen how they try to strip faith out of this country, how they try to make people afraid to speak about God. I've seen churches threatened, families forced to stay silent about their beliefs, children taught that faith is something to be ashamed of." His expression hardened, his grip tightening on the podium. "And I'll tell you this right now, I won't let that happen. I won't let them erase what makes this country great." The room, which had been quiet moments ago, was now alive with a soft rumble of agreement. Lily shifted slightly, looking up at Trump again, and when she spoke, her voice was small but unwavering. "But how do you know?" she asked. "How do you know for sure that God is always there?" Trump exhaled, his expression unreadable for a second. And then, to the surprise of everyone, he stepped back from the podium. He took a deep breath and let his gaze move across the room, almost as if he was deciding whether or not to share something. And then he spoke. "Because I've felt him," he said simply. The murmurs stopped. "When I lost my brother Fred," he continued, his voice quieter now, "I was angry, I was hurt, and for a long time I tried to fill that hurt with everything except faith. Success, money, distractions. I chased all of it, but none of it worked." His eyes lifted again, and then, one night I had this dream, or maybe it wasn't a dream, maybe it was something else. But I saw Fred. I saw him standing there, smiling at me, like he always did. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. The audience was silent again. I don't know if it was a message from God or if it was just my own heart finally opening up, but in that moment, I knew. I knew that he wasn't really gone. I knew that there was more than just this life. And I knew that faith wasn't about proof. It was about trust. Lily's lips parted slightly. "Like climbing the ladder," she whispered. Trump smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Exactly, like climbing the ladder." The air in the room had changed again. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was something bigger, something people would leave remembering. And something told them it wasn't over yet. The room remained still, charged with an almost sacred energy. Lily, her eyes glistening with quiet understanding, pressed her small fingers into the worn leather of her grandmother's Bible. Trump's words hung in the air, their weight settling over the gathering like a warm but heavy blanket. The silence wasn't empty. It was full, full of contemplation, of unspoken thoughts, of personal battles no one dared speak aloud. Then, from the back of the room, a man rose. His voice was rough, unpolished, carrying the weight of years that hadn't been kind. "Mr. Trump," he began, his deep baritone slicing through the silence like a knife through thick fabric. "I grew up going to church. My mama made sure of it, but I lost my faith a long time ago." Murmurs stirred through the audience. Trump, still leaning slightly on the podium, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He simply listened. The man exhaled, running a rough hand through his graying hair. "Life's been hard," he admitted. "I've seen good men die. I've seen bad men thrive. I've seen families torn apart, people losing everything, and I've looked up at the sky more times than I can count, asking the same thing." He shook his head. Where was God then? A ripple of agreement swept through the room. People nodded, exchanged glances. This wasn't just one man's question, it was their question. The one that gnawed at them in the dead of night, that lingered in the empty corners of hospital rooms, that whispered through the silence of unpaid bills and lost loved ones. Where was God when the world fell apart? Trump exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping lightly on the podium. His gaze swept the crowd, landing once again on Lily before settling back on the man. "That's the hardest question of them all, isn't it?" he said finally. "Because if we could answer that, maybe faith wouldn't be so difficult." The man nodded stiffly, his arms folding across his chest as he braced himself for what Trump might say next. Trump straightened, his usual commanding presence softened by something uncharacteristically raw. "You ever heard the story of the storm?" he asked, his voice quieter now, drawing the audience in. The man's brows furrowed slightly. "Which one?" Trump tilted his head. "The one about the guy trapped on his roof?" A murmur of recognition rippled through a few members of the audience, but most remained quiet, waiting. Trump continued. "Big storm hits, floods rising. Guy stuck on his roof, praying, begging for God to save him. God, please get me out of this, show me a sign." He paused, his voice lowering to pull the room in further. Not long after, a neighbor comes by in a rowboat, says, "Hop in, let's get out of here." The guy shakes his head, says, "No, God's gonna save me." A few chuckles, slight, hesitant, moved through the room. Couple hours go by, water's still rising. A rescue team comes in a motorboat. They tell him, "Sir, get in, this storm's getting worse." And you know what he says? Trump smirked slightly. No, God's gonna save me." Even the man who had asked the question allowed himself the faintest of smiles. "Finally, the water's nearly at the rooftop," Trump continued. "Helicopter comes. They drop a rope down. They beg him, 'Sir, this is your last chance.' He shook his head, and still he says, 'No, God's got me.'" The crowd was hooked now, waiting for the punchline. Trump exhaled. Flood takes him, he drowns, ends up at the pearly gates, standing in front of God, and he's mad. Says, "God, why didn't you save me?" A beat of silence. "And you know what God says?" Trump glanced around the room. "I sent you a rowboat, I sent you a motorboat, I sent you a helicopter. What else do you want?" Laughter broke through the tension, scattered chuckles growing into something bigger. Even the man who had stood with his arms crossed now had a small smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Trump's smile faded slightly, returning to something more serious. "That's the thing about faith," he said. "We expect it to look one way, to feel a certain way. We expect to hear a voice from the clouds, to see miracles that make the news." He shook his head. "But sometimes, faith is a neighbor in a rowboat. Sometimes, faith is a motorboat. Sometimes, it's a little girl standing up in front of a crowd, asking the questions everyone else is too afraid to ask." Lily's eyes widened. "And sometimes," Trump added, his voice deepening, "faith is just holding on, even when it feels like the water's rising." The room was silent again, but this time, it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of doubt. It was the quiet that comes when people realize they might have just heard the answer they'd been searching for. The man who had asked the question cleared his throat, nodding slowly. "I never thought about it like that." His voice was quieter now, less guarded. Trump nodded back. "None of us do, not until we have to." The crowd was no longer just listening. They were feeling the words. Something had shifted. This wasn't just another town hall anymore. It wasn't about policies or politics. It was about something much deeper. And the night wasn't over yet. The room, once filled with political discussions and policy-driven debates, had transformed into something far more profound. The air itself seemed heavier, not with tension, but with the weight of deep reflection. People weren't just listening anymore. They were absorbing, feeling the words that had been spoken. And yet, even after Trump's story of faith in unexpected places, there was still an unease in the air, a hesitation, a collective breath being held. It wasn't over yet. Just as the atmosphere settled into quiet contemplation, another voice rose, shaking but determined. A woman, perhaps in her early 60s, stood near the middle of the hall. Her silver hair was neatly pulled back, her hands clasped in front of her as though she were holding onto something invisible. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady but carrying a tremor beneath the surface. "I lost my husband last year. 50 years of marriage, and just like that he was gone. One minute he was holding my hand, and the next—" She paused, inhaling deeply as if forcing herself to continue. "I prayed. Oh, how I prayed. But he still died." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others lowered their heads, knowing the weight of grief all too well. She swallowed hard before speaking again. "I've been angry at God ever since. I can't even bring myself to pray anymore. It just feels pointless." Her voice cracked on the last word, a raw, honest confession, the kind of pain that couldn't be softened by platitudes, the kind that people carried silently, day after day, wondering if they'd ever feel whole again. Trump didn't answer right away. He didn't rush to fill the silence, didn't reach for a rehearsed response. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her. The bravado, the larger-than-life presence, it all faded for a moment, replaced by something far more human. "I hear you," he said at last, his voice lower now, softer. "I know what it's like to feel that kind of loss, to ask yourself why them, why now?" He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "And I know how easy it is to shut God out, because you don't get the answer you want." The woman's hands trembled, and she clutched them tighter together, as if holding on to a piece of herself that was threatening to slip away. Trump leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but filled with something deeper, understanding. "You said you stopped praying because it felt pointless, but let me ask you this. Did you ever stop talking to him?" The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard. I don't know," she admitted. "I still think about him, about what I'd say, about what he'd say back." "That's prayer," Trump said simply. "People think prayer has to be formal, that it has to be kneeling in a pew, saying the right words in the right way. But real prayer?" He gestured slightly. "It's just talking, even when you're angry, even when you're hurt, even when you don't have the words." The woman's lips parted slightly, as though she had never considered that possibility before. "Do you think God is mad at you?" Trump asked. She hesitated, then nodded slightly, as if she were afraid to admit it. Trump smiled, but it was gentle, almost wistful. "He's not," he said. "He's listening, even in the silence, even in your worst moments, especially in your worst moments." The woman inhaled sharply, and for the first time that evening, tears spilled over her cheeks. But she didn't wipe them away. The crowd remained silent, watching, waiting. Some were visibly moved, others deep in thought, processing their own battles with faith, loss, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, God hadn't abandoned them after all. And then, from the very front row, Lily spoke again, her small voice barely above a whisper but carrying more weight than anyone could have expected. "My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds," she said. Trump turned his attention to her, nodding for her to continue. "You don't always see them grow right away," she went on, "but you have to believe they will. A hush fell over the room. It was such a simple thought, something an 8-year-old might say, without realizing its depths. And yet, in that moment, it felt like the most profound truth in the world. Trump's expression softened, something flickering behind his eyes. "Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman," he said. "And she's right." The woman who had spoken about her husband wiped at her cheeks, nodding slightly. It wasn't an instant cure for her grief. It never would be. But maybe, just maybe, she had found something to hold on to again. The energy in the room had shifted once more. Not just political, not just personal, but something spiritual, something raw and real. And somehow, everyone in that hall knew the conversation wasn't over yet. The room felt alive in a way that had nothing to do with politics. Conversations like these, raw, unfiltered, didn't happen at campaign rallies, didn't fit into sound bites. But here, in this small fellowship hall, faith, doubt, and grief had taken center stage. The woman who had spoken about losing her husband had returned to her seat, but the weight of her question still lingered. The crowd wasn't restless, wasn't checking their watches or shifting in their seats. They were waiting, not for a policy answer, not for a political promise, but for something deeper, something real. And Trump? He could feel it. He stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edges as he glanced around the room. This wasn't like standing in an arena with tens of thousands chanting his name. It was smaller, quieter, more personal. But in some ways it was bigger, because here there was nowhere to hide. No teleprompters, no rehearsed one-liners, just him and the people in front of him, waiting for something honest. He took a slow breath, his voice carrying the weight of reflection. "You know, when I was younger, I thought faith was just something people talked about. I heard my parents say it, saw people pray, but I never really thought about what it meant. It wasn't until life started throwing real challenges at me that I had to ask myself, what do I believe?" A pause. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Trump continued, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "People always see the successes, right? The buildings, the name on the headlines, but they don't see the failures, the losses, the moments when you wonder if you're ever going to make it out the other side." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "And I've had those moments, more than I can count." His eyes flicked toward Lily, the little girl who had started all of this. She was still clutching her Bible, her wide eyes locked onto him as though every word mattered. "Now, I'll tell you something I don't talk about much," Trump said, his voice dipping even lower, drawing the crowd in. "Years ago, I went through one of the hardest times of my life. Everything felt like it was crumbling. Business troubles, personal struggles, betrayals I didn't see coming. I was surrounded by people, but I never felt more alone. And you know what I did?" The room was silent. "I got angry," he admitted. "Angry at myself, angry at the world, maybe even angry at God. Because I kept thinking, why is this happening? I worked hard. I did everything I was supposed to do. So why does it feel like I'm losing everything?" A few heads in the crowd nodded, as though they had asked themselves the same thing. And then one day an old friend of mine, someone I really respected, pulled me aside and said something I'll never forget. He said, "Don, you keep asking why, but maybe you should start asking what now." Trump paused, letting the words sink in. "It hit me like a ton of bricks," he admitted, "because I realized that faith, real faith, doesn't mean never struggling. It doesn't mean never questioning. It means trusting even when you don't have all the answers. It means standing up, moving forward, even when you don't see the whole path ahead." The audience was still, hanging onto every word. "And let me tell you something," Trump said, his voice firm now, steady. "That lesson, it stuck with me. I stopped asking why and started asking what now. And when I did, things started changing. Maybe not all at once, maybe not in the way I expected, but step by step. And I realized God wasn't ignoring me. He wasn't punishing me. He was preparing me. A deep breath. The energy in the room was electric. That's faith, Trump continued. It's not about sitting back and waiting for things to be easy. It's about walking forward even when it's hard. Even when you don't see the full picture. Even when you're scared out of your mind. Lily, still in her seat, wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her dress. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. And then from the back of the room another voice spoke up. A man this time, older, with a face lined by years of work and worry. "Mr. Trump," he called, standing up. "You talk about faith like it's something you have to choose. But what if you just don't feel it anymore? What if you want to believe, but you just can't?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and the rawness of it sent another ripple through the audience. Trump looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. "That's an honest question," he said. "And you know what? I think everyone in this room has felt that at some point. I know I have." The man swallowed hard. His hands balled into fists at his sides. "And I'll tell you this," Trump went on. "Faith isn't about feeling it every second of every day. It's not about being certain all the time. It's about choosing to keep going even when you're not sure. It's about standing up, taking the next step, even when you don't know exactly where it's leading." The man lowered his head slightly, nodding. "And you can believe again," Trump added, "not because someone forces you to, not because you have to, but because deep down you want to. And that's enough to start." A heavy silence settled over the room, thick with unspoken emotions. Then, from the front row, Lily spoke again, her voice small but certain. "God doesn't need us to be perfect," she whispered. "He just needs us to try." A shiver ran through the crowd. A few people wiped at their eyes. Trump smiled, nodding toward her. "Exactly, kid, exactly." And with that, the moment shifted again, because this wasn't just a political conversation anymore. It was something much, much bigger. The air in the fellowship hall was thick with a kind of energy that was rare. One that wasn't driven by politics, by policy debates, or by partisanship. It was something deeper, something raw. The conversation that had begun with an innocent yet profound question from a little girl had unraveled into something far beyond what anyone in the room had expected. Faith, doubt, loss, hope. These were the things being discussed now. Not the economy, not the election, not legislation, just humanity. Trump had stepped away from the podium slightly, his body language more open, more personal. The man in the back, the one who had asked about losing faith, had sat down again, his gaze lowered in contemplation. Around the room, people weren't just listening anymore, they were feeling. Trump looked over the crowd, his expression softer than usual. "You know," he began, his voice low but steady. "For a long time, I thought faith was something that just happened to people, that you either had it or you didn't, that it was like flipping a switch. But that's not how it works. It's more like," he paused, searching for the words, "it's more like a muscle. You have to work at it, and if you stop using it, it gets weak. But if you fight for it, if you keep pushing through the doubt, through the pain, it gets stronger." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Trump's gaze shifted back to Lily. She was watching him, her Bible still held close, her tiny fingers tracing over its worn leather cover as if drawing strength from it. He nodded at her, then turned his attention to the rest of the room. "I've seen people go through some of the hardest things you can imagine," he continued. "People who lost everything, people who had no reason to believe in anything anymore, and yet, they did. Not because it was easy, not because it made sense, but because deep down, they needed to. And I think that's what faith really is. It's not about knowing, it's about choosing." Another pause. Another wave of silence, thick and heavy, pressing down on the room like a physical weight. Then a woman in the front row lifted her hand. She looked to be in her 60s, her silver hair neatly tied back, her hands trembling slightly as she stood. "Mr. Trump," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering, "I lost my son last year. He was only 35. A good man, a father, a believer." She swallowed hard. "And I keep asking myself, why? Why would God take him and leave me here? What am I supposed to do with that? The question sent a ripple of emotion through the audience. A few people looked down at their laps, as if afraid to meet her gaze. Others wiped at their eyes, their own grief surfacing in the shared moment. Trump's expression shifted. He wasn't just the speaker anymore. He was listening. Really listening. Hank moved on, repeating himself. He took a deep breath. "I'm not going to pretend I have the perfect answer for that," he said, his voice softer now, "because I don't think anyone does." He let out a slow exhale. "I lost my brother, Fred. It was one of the hardest things I've ever been through, and for a long time, I didn't understand. I was angry, confused. I kept asking, why? But you know what I've come to realize?" The woman blinked at him, her lips slightly parted as if bracing herself for what he was about to say. "I was asking the wrong question," Trump said. "Instead of asking, why did this happen to me, I should have been asking, what am I supposed to do with it? What can I learn? How can I take the love I had for him and use it to make the world a little better?" Because that's what faith is. Not getting the answers we want, but trusting that there are answers. Ones we may not understand yet. The woman covered her mouth with her hand, a small choked sound escaping her lips. A few others in the audience wiped at their eyes. Lily, still seated, whispered something to her mother. Her mother nodded encouragingly, and the little girl hesitated only for a moment before standing up again. "I think my grandma used to say something like that," Lily said, her voice small but clear. She said, "Sometimes God doesn't answer your questions the way you want, but that doesn't mean he isn't answering." Trump smiled, really smiled, in a way that softened the usual sharp edges of his expression. "Your grandma was a wise woman, Lily," he said. The audience sat in stunned silence for a moment, as if absorbing the unexpected weight of the evening. This wasn't just a political event anymore. It wasn't a campaign stop. It had become something else entirely. Something sacred. Then, as if sensing the need for a shift in the energy, Trump exhaled and straightened up slightly. "You know," he said, "I've spoken in a lot of places. Stadiums, arenas, the White House. But this is one of the most important conversations I've ever had." A few chuckles broke through the heavy emotion in the room. "And let me tell you something," Trump continued, his voice firm now. "We live in a world that keeps trying to take faith away from us. It tells us to be ashamed of it, to keep it quiet, to pretend it doesn't matter. But let me be very clear. Faith does matter. It's what keeps us strong, it's what gives us hope, and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it." A round of applause broke out, not the kind that was polite, not the kind that was automatic. It was genuine, earnest. Trump looked at Lily once more. "And I'll tell you this," he said. "Faith doesn't belong to politicians. It doesn't belong to preachers. It belongs to people. To kids like you who are brave enough to ask the big questions. To people like your grandma who left behind wisdom for you to carry." He nodded. "That's what matters." The applause grew louder. Some people stood. A few had tears in their eyes. And in the middle of it all, Lily smiled. Small and quiet, but full of something that had not been there before. Hope. The room was still humming with the energy of the moment, a kind of electricity that wasn't loud, but deeply felt. Conversations murmured throughout the fellowship hall as people exchanged glances, nods, and even quiet tears. What had started as a simple town hall, the little girl still held her grandmother's Bible tightly, but something in her demeanor had changed. She wasn't just clutching it anymore. She was holding it with a newfound confidence, as if the weight of her question had finally been lifted. Trump smiled, a rare expression that carried none of the bravado he was so often known for. "You know, Lily," he said, his voice steady but warm, "I think your grandma would be very proud of you tonight." The girl's eyes shimmered with emotion, and she nodded slowly, wiping at her cheeks with the back of her hand. Her mother placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, pride radiating from her expression. The audience, still seated, remained unusually quiet, as if they were reluctant to let the moment slip away too soon. It wasn't every day that people left a political event feeling as if they had just attended something much more profound. Trump turned his attention back to the crowd, his expression serious once more. "You know," he said, stepping slightly away from the podium, "we're living in a time where people want us to be afraid to talk about faith. They tell us it's outdated, that it doesn't belong in public, that it doesn't matter anymore. But I'll tell you what, faith is exactly what this country needs right now, because without it, we lose something bigger than just our beliefs. We lose our strength, our hope, our ability to keep going even when things feel impossible." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous or performative. It was genuine. A few people stood, nodding, clapping, not just for the words he had spoken, but for what they represented. Trump nodded, acknowledging them, then turned back to Lily. "And you," he said, his tone slightly lighter now. "You reminded us all tonight why asking the big questions is so important." He extended a hand, and without hesitation, the little girl placed her small hand in his. They shook, and the moment felt far greater than just a simple gesture. It was a passing of something intangible but powerful. The event was coming to an end, but it was clear that no one in that room would leave quite the same as when they had entered. Conversations would be had on the drive home, reflections would linger long after the chairs had been stacked and the lights turned off. This wasn't just a night about politics. It had become something much greater. As Trump turned to exit, he looked back at the crowd one final time. "Hold on to your faith," he said, "and don't be afraid to ask the questions that matter." And with that, the evening came to a close, not with campaign slogans or policy promises, but with something far more enduring, a reminder that faith, no matter how tested, is never truly lost. This story wasn't just about a little girl asking a question. It was about the power of faith, the courage to seek answers, and the importance of holding on to what truly matters. In a world that often feels divided, moments like these remind us that faith isn't about politics or public opinion. It's about strength, hope, and the belief that we are never truly alone. Lily's question opened a door that many are afraid to walk through, and Trump's response showed that even the most powerful figures wrestle with the same doubts and struggles as the rest of us. If this story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on your own faith, and don't be afraid to ask the questions that truly matter. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video so that more people can experience this incredible moment of faith, reflection, and unity.